Government communications isn't a walk in the park. Here at the Gov Comms Collective, we tackle some of your biggest questions. I'm your host, Hannah Elizabeth, and I'm excited to get into the weeds with you. So, let's get into it.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Gov Comms Collective. I'm your host, Hannah Elizabeth, and I'm so excited to be here today with podcasting legend, Lori Vajda.
Thank you. I think I really love the title legend. I've never been referred to that way, so thank you.
Of course. I think guru is like way overdone nowadays, so I'm like,
Totally.
something else. But you really are a legend. I mean, the first experience I ever had with podcasting was with you, and you're kind of the reason that I wanted to get into it. And you've been supportive of it. And just, I'm so excited to have you be here with me and like kick off this whole new exciting adventure.
So cool. You know, it's exciting to hear you say that being a guest on my podcast led to you wanting to start your own podcast. And now here you are inviting me. And I feel special because you invited me to be a guest on your podcast. So thank you.
Of course, I love seeing things like this come full circle. And it's just such a fun way to interact. And I mean, I love social media. I have to, being a Gov communicator. Yes. But I get tired of it, truth be told. And I miss the face-to-face interaction with people. And I feel like this is just such a fun, unique way of getting people's stories out there and just sharing our collective experiences and all those good things.
Well, you know, there's been some research that really talks about why podcasting works so well. And it's really what happens with that voice coming directly into your ear. So it's as though that conversation is lighting up the different regions of your brain. And there's an intimacy that's there because it's directly into your ear versus when you watch something, there's a space between you. So your own experience and your way of describing it is what other people experience. And I think it's what's really led to quite an increase or the spread of podcasting, just because, you know, when you think about, I don't know about you, but I remember being even in elementary school and, you know, kindergarten or first grade and the teacher reading a book to you, right? And you're just mesmerized by the story that unfolds. And when you have that connection in your ear and you're listening to somebody else's story unfolding, it draws you right back into that experience.
Oh, it does. Absolutely. About, I'd say probably 2 years ago, I started listening to bedtime stories. So it's a podcast and they release them, I don't know, a couple times a week or something in the free version. And they're anywhere from like 45 minutes to like 2.5 hours. And it's just this guy with a British accent and he reads bedtime stories. And
all kinds?
They'll be all different kinds. Sometimes they're based off of like Disney stories, or it's a retelling of a different story, or sometimes it's just something nice to fall asleep to. There was one that I was listening to about this girl who lives in this cottage, and it was the middle of the winter in New England, and she was making her coffee in the morning and reading a book by the fireplace, and it was just like so cozy and relaxing. It's just so cool, the different forms that podcasts can take. Like, it doesn't always have to be informative. It can be these fun, playful, different stories. So I just love the versatility.
I'm like, okay, I have to get the details on the podcast for bedtime stories. I love the idea. And there used to be, like on your radio, a station that you could go to similar when you were driving that just did stories. So I had a friend who lived in Fort Lauderdale, and she would drive to Miami and she would listen to these books, these stories. And then they took that off the air. So now you've given me, see, podcasting, you know, they are the epitome of filling a niche, and there's always something for someone that's out there. And if not, then there's somebody to create it. Just kind of like what you're doing for people in your industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about how much we love podcasts, but what was it that got you into podcasting? Why did you decide, or what was it that was like, yes, this is the moment. Like, this is what I want to get into. This is what I'm passionate about. Because you've been in the podcasting world for a little bit now, and I feel like you were really part of this whole industry before it became so mainstream. Like, everyone now has their own podcast, but you've really like narrowed in and like focused in on it. So like, how did you get there?
So it started with just the idea of I love to talk, right? And and people were blogging and writing, articles for different platforms. And I thought, oh, that'd be great. I could try that. But the act of sitting down and typing it out my fingers just moved slower than my mouth and my brain. So I thought, all right, let me just try talking. I'll use transcript and I'll just talk out my thought. But then I would watch this line go all the way through and I would see all these errors happening and I'd want to stop and correct it. And I thought, well, this isn't working. And so then the next one was the idea of podcasting made perfect sense. And I had a friend and we were trying to figure out a way to work together to help women. Really, at the time, it was a side business because we recognized that women don't get the same advantages that many men do in having experience or the opportunities for growing their career. Men tend to get put up for promotion more than women do. And so the thought was, build your own solution. And a way to do that is to start a side business, and you can learn all of those things that will help you in your profession. So that was the initial idea. I think what ended up happening in there was, well, we talked about the idea, we planned it, and then I got a diagnosis for cancer. And doing a podcast, we hadn't launched the podcast, and the podcast became prepping and getting ready and establishing all the elements that you would need to produce a podcast. That was my connection to my friend. And we would set these up, and I was going through treatment, and it was sometimes super difficult. Like I could hardly keep my eyes open. She talks about a time that I actually fell over falling asleep because I was so exhausted from the treatment. But the podcast holds a real special place in my heart because I considered it my lifeline back to being normal and not being a statistic or, a medical patient. I was something more. And so I used that. And then what ended up happening is I started reaching out to people to be guests, and I fell in love with people telling their stories. And so that became, how do I get better at telling stories, and how do I help others get better at telling stories? Because I think you learn a lot about a person through the stories that they share.
I think that is just so empowering and beautiful to hear. I didn't know that. So props to you. And I love hearing stories like that.
Thank you.
I can relate to an extent. I had pretty major back surgery about 5 years ago. And afterwards was part of the reason that I started getting into the digital accessibility world, because I saw in the physical sense the lack of accessibility in real life and what a lot of people go through. And like, unless you've experienced it, you don't really know. So like, I can understand using that and not wanting to just be another number, just another medical stat, like using that to like power through and like get through it. It's just very powerful. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Well, and thank you for sharing your experience, because, accessibility became an outreach of messaging and storytelling and communication, and the power that, we tend to think of people who have challenges as limitations. And yet, when you expand accessibility, which is the knowledge share that you did with me, into these kind of, no, it doesn't have to have a mental health diagnosis or a medical diagnosis. We can suffer from being on the screen too long. We can have challenges hearing. And by hearing, I don't mean that you're deaf. I mean, there's certain sounds that don't come up, or your brain, if you have ADHD or ADD, sometimes the screen can be more challenging and audio can be more soothing. So when you expand out what accessibility means, which is what you educated me on, then you realize, oh, podcasting has a way to reach a lot of people in a variety of ways, because you can do audio, you can do closed caption, and you can do video, and you can do transcripts. So I can read the whole thing and still get a sense of it. That's a pretty powerful platform that not a lot of the ways that we communicate or market our brand or our business or any of those, very few can reach so many people for where they are or where they're located.
And I think that perfectly ties back to one of the things that you and I had talked about in a previous conversation, that being in government, there's so much red tape that we have to navigate. And it can be really hard to get some things approved by upper management or leadership. And sometimes it seems like there's so much of a focus on the things that we can't do rather than the things that we can do. And so I think changing that narrative and focusing on, well, podcasting might be something that we can do to reduce those barriers and to reach more of our constituents or our residents or whoever it is in our community that we're trying to communicate with. And I just think it's so cool that this is another opportunity for us to break through some of those barriers and really foster those communities, strengthen those communities. And at the end of the day, just build relationships beyond an us versus them type of mentality. Because I think, at least from what I've experienced working in government in Florida and even here in Utah, there's very much of a distrust in government, and that's nationally. It's always kind of been that way, and there's a lot of studies and polls that show that. So what are your thoughts on, or I guess, what is your advice for other government communicators who might want to start a podcast in their office but don't really know where to begin or how to bring the conversation up with those decision makers?
First of all, I have a background that I worked in government. And, when I hear some of the roadblocks that come up, it always takes me back to some of the obstacles that I faced that have become people are so used to it in government that things take a long time to make a change for, that they just kind of go with it. And they don't even realize that in the private sector, decisions get made very quickly. Things move forward very quickly. And so it's like slam on the brakes and wait a decade, or full speed ahead is that kind of place to be. But I think that there are a lot of uses for podcasting in government that people tend to think worst case scenario before they think, how can we best utilize it? A good way, just some really off the top of my head ways to do that, is to find out what would work in your community or your particular department. For example, maybe you want to highlight a constituent in your community and showcase the residents or showcase somebody who's making a difference and giving it a great title, like Heroes Among Us, or people that are making a difference, or kids that are making a difference. Or, you could do it by age group. You could do it by industry. You could do it by business, so that you're just giving people a place that they can come and talk or be talked about in a positive light that doesn't you're not worried about saying the wrong thing. You're really highlighting. You're not giving any secrets away. There's nothing demeaning about it. It's all a positive. And so when you get that kind of practice and the positive, and you let people know, then you can get into some of those more touchier subjects. That's number one. Number two is you're not doing it live. You may be recording live, but your podcast isn't streaming live. So you can always have somebody listen to what has been recorded and make suggestions for editing out should something be kind of sensitive, whether it's personally sensitive to the person you're interviewing or personally sensitive to the department. But you have the ability to edit, so you also have the ability to turn out some really great information. And then you can attach resources to it, links, and invite people to share more or to nominate somebody to be a guest, or for more information, where can they go? So think of the businesses in your community and the parks and recreation in your community, all of these things that you could bring to your citizens in something that is anything from a couple minutes to quite lengthy if you wanted to. Or as you talked about in the beginning, maybe you just want to have your department share stories, just whatever that news story is specifically for your area, anything that you can think of. But I think if you start with the positive, how do we showcase the people and bring that directly to our residents? Or how do we showcase people in our department so faces and voices and titles and names become recognized as helpful, as friendly? Because that's, when you sit down at a podcast, you're having a conversation with somebody, right? And it's fun. So that comes across, that joy comes out. And gosh, I can't think of a better way to connect people within a department with the community they serve in a way that's kind of a give and take.
I love that. And especially just bringing in other people from the community and having those community voices. I think that can just be so powerful because it shows we're one of you guys. Like we are in the communities that you live in and you work in, you play in, like we're in this together. I think one thing that can be difficult for some people is the thought of being on camera. So even with a podcast, usually it's, there's not the video element included. There can be, but how do you prepare for speaking on a podcast? What are your biggest tips for people who might be shy but think it might be a great opportunity for the community or for their organization?
A lot of the tips I borrow from acting, from being a keynote, and from the recommendations when we had COVID and everybody was switching to Zoom and other video platforms. People were very stoic. They were afraid of movement, and it was like deer in the headlights. And then over the course, we started to adapt best practices. And so I think of some of those as being just common. So for example, in normal conversation, when we get excited, our voice modulates naturally. But when you're nervous on a podcast, you don't naturally do that. So the more relaxed a host can make a guest so that you get to that place where we just enjoy each other's company, the easier it'll be for the guest to have that modulation in their tone and in their speech as well. But if your host doesn't really think that way and you're the guest and you've been preparing, one trick to do is put a mirror at kind of the top of your screen, which is where the light is that your camera is at, to remind yourself to smile. Because when you smile, your voice naturally changes, right? So if I want to make my voice move so that there's a rhythm to it and it's more interesting to listen to, smiling is a great way to do that. Pacing makes a really big difference. Often when we get stuck, we have our go-to default words that we use, and you want to be mindful of that because too much of that really detracts from what you're trying to share. And a good example of that is the word like or if you put it up there, like just in front of you, you realize that a pause rather than a word substitute, that we can shorten in editing. So to move away from your so's, likes, just pause where that word would naturally come in and say the rest of the sentence. It's not that you can't say like or any of those, because that's natural too. We pause. But if that's your go-to default, then you just want to remind yourself to withhold that and let the editor bridge the gap in the pause. One more suggestion is your personality. And I think your personality, you want to bring that forward. So if you are naturally, maybe you have a dry wit, or you laugh at your own jokes, which is me. I would be raising my hand. I laugh at my own jokes. I feel like if I'm funny and I think I'm funny, then other people, who cares if other people laugh at that point, right?
But you won't hear them at least.
You won't hear. Exactly. I'll have heard mine. And so that's all I need to know that was a funny joke. But I think you really want to think about your personality and showcase it. Don't be afraid to bring it in, because that's who you truly are. And that sounds far more natural, especially when you're nervous, is to get to that point. And then the last one is just know at the beginning, you are going to almost have a freeze kind of style. Your language might not flow. It might go up. You might have those tone pitches that come up when you get nervous. But breathing to your belly, to your lower diaphragm, really helps bring your tone down so it has a smoothness to it. Whereas when we're nervous, we do upper chest breathing and then our voice gets really high. A little bit of my Mickey Mouse.
I was just about to say, you could be the next Mickey voiceover.
Yeah. So those things can really help. Breathe from your lower diaphragm. Pause if you have those default words that are your go-to fillers. Bring in your personality. Don't be afraid to showcase your humor or your dry wit or whatever makes you naturally you. And then have that mirror, because smiling really helps move your tone and your voice and your personality.
Thank you. I love that. I think one of the other things that we've always done in the beginning of our podcast is we'll just chit chat for anywhere, 10, 15, 20 minutes and just catch up and break the ice. And I think that's always been so helpful, whether it was purposeful or not. I've always enjoyed just talking to people before a recording, and it's like, okay, you get in the flow of things and you realize that it's really not that big of a deal and everything is going to be okay. And it doesn't have to be this big scary thing.
Yeah, that is a great tip. If you're going to host yourself, maybe you'll be the only one that'll be on, or maybe you'll interview guests, or you'll have other people, you'll have a co-host. But that's a great tip. I always try to meet with somebody ahead of time to really talk about what the focus is going to be and to get a sense of what lights them up that they love to talk about that is related to the topic that we're discussing. And so that helps as a break the ice. But when it's the day of, you get really nervous. I still get nervous. I'm a guest on somebody else's show. I want to be the best guest for them and for their audience. I want to have fun too. So for me, those nerves all come up. And that chit-chatting that you just described really makes it seem like this is just a natural conversation. And I think that helps your guest feel more comfortable with your process and how you're going to approach it.
I think so too. And it's kind of a natural segue into the recording. Whereas if you open up the program, you're like, all right, well, I guess we're going to start now. It can just be that awkward. Okay, deep breaths. Okay, I got this. Whereas, like what we do, and we're like, oh yeah, maybe we should start recording.
General conversation.
Exactly. So one thing I actually wanted to tie back to what you said earlier is that a podcast can be anywhere from a couple minutes to way lengthier. How do you fine tune that? How do you figure out what your sweet spot is, whether it's these shorter 5-minute audio bites or something that's lengthier, like an hour?
Really good question. Again, there's research out there that kind of has what that midpoint is. And all that midpoint really talks about is what the majority of listeners, how long they spend listening to a podcast. So I think you want to keep that in mind, but think about who your audience is. For example, if you were in government, you might want to do short things because you may be updating people or interviewing them. They're just grabbing some of those bullet points or tidbits or short stories or just enough to get the information they need. Whereas, for example, there's a bunch of podcasts for true crime, and those go for like an hour, and their listeners are obsessed with that platform that talks about that particular topic. So lengthier is more because, like you were talking about in the storytelling, you're really getting into it. In general, I like the shorter because I like to time it to the activity that I'm doing. So I think, all right, who's my audience? Yep. What are we talking about? And what's the length of time that somebody could get all the information in, and that is that sweet spot? So I think that really plays a big part in it. But there's also another way to think about it, and that is just short form content. And short form content has really grown recently because we're inundated with so much information. So short form can be 5 minutes to a little over 20 minutes really is considered short form. So it's less than a half hour. So your guest, your format, your topic, who you're trying to reach, all of those things should be taken into consideration. For you, let me ask you, what's your sweet spot for your podcast?
I would probably say like right in the 20 to 30-minute range. For me personally, when I'm listening to podcasts, it's either on the commute to work, which is about 25 minutes, or if I'm doing cardio, which is about 25 minutes, or getting ready in the morning. So that's kind of the idea of what I assume some of our listeners are going to be listening to it, or, on their lunch break, something quick. I don't want them to have to be considering, oh, maybe I'll listen to it later because I don't really have an hour to sit down right now. I want something that's more accessible for people and fits in the time frames of when they're already having some of that downtime. Love how you tied that in, that like try to fit it into like what people are already doing. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. So I now want to pick your brain on the other topic. If an agency, a public sector agency or organization were going to add podcasting, in general speaking, because that's pretty much who your client or who your employer is, what would be your suggestion for people starting out? What would in public sector, what would you recommend that they start their podcast at?
I would say in the 20-minute range. That way, depending who you're interviewing. So if it's about a project update. So for instance, at work, we're bringing a double set of railroad tracks to 9 different segments throughout Salt Lake City area. And so for us to do little project updates, it could be really helpful. Like, all right, this is what's going on in Woods Cross. This is the update that we have for Salt Lake City, things like that, where there's not too much pressure that like, oh, how are we going to fill 45 minutes or something like that? But it's enough that you can get the information out there without it being overkill or being super, super in the weeds with technical information.
I think that's a really helpful tip. And also, it reminds me of English or college papers where you would ask the professor, how long does it have to be? And
Yep.
I loved the answer, as long as it needs to be. So if you set that 20-minute mark and you don't need the full 20 minutes, don't use them. Edit it down. People will appreciate that you gave them what they needed.
Well, thank you. We are just about out of time, but if you have any last words of advice for any of our Gov communicators out there on how they can get started, maybe about some different tools that are helpful, because with shoestring budgets, it can be very hard to get funding for new projects. So maybe different ways that they can do it cost effective.
A lot of the platforms, a lot of the tools have a free start, at least not a trial for free, but kind of a free platform. For example, you get 2 hours free if you want to use that to host your podcast, or some of the tools for editing. You have so much time or so much of length that you can use to edit. So try to do the free first. Try it out and see what's there. There's a lot that you can do on a shoestring budget. There are tools for logos. There are tools for color palettes, all free, that you can do just to get it started. And equipment like a mic, you can get for under $100. So you can use whole headset. You can use your general in-ear Bluetooth headset. There's a lot of things you can do just getting started that will be good enough and feel to the listener like you have provided them with something valuable. But I say, don't invest a lot of money, because the average podcast doesn't make it past, I think, 50 episodes. Like businesses, starting a business, they fail in the first 5 years. It's a similar thing that happens with the podcast. So if you're unsure and you're just wanting to try it out, you can probably rent even a microphone. I would look at that from your local public library. There's a lot of things that you could do. Plus, you could probably have access to a room that's very quiet that you could record your podcast in and not even have to build a sound system in your or anything like that in your own residence. So utilize what's there. and just ask for word of mouth. And I think I'm going to say this, come back to this podcast, because this will help you. This show that you have, Hannah, will help a lot of people.
Well, thank you so much. It has been so much fun chatting with you today. And I'm just, again, so thankful that you came on the show and you shared your knowledge and are helping us build a stronger Gov Communications little
It's
crew.
my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inspiring me. And thank you for being such a great host.
Oh, thanks, Lori.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the Gov Comms Collective. Like what you heard? Don't forget to share with a friend, colleague, or office bestie. If you're new to the show, welcome. Stay tuned for new episodes released every other week. That's all we've got for today. Catch you next time.